Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Membav contains two Mishnayos, which divide the Daf into three sugyas. The first is commenting on our most recent Mishnah, which had two completely separate halachas about the dough stuck in the wall of a basket. And the Mishnah seemed to connect and relate the two, and our Gemara wants to know how they are related. The Gemara will have four approaches to how they are connected or related or not. Then we'll begin the first Mishnah on the Daf, which discusses what the time for becoming chametz is once you add water to flour and make the dough. When does chametz take effect? And then the second Mishnah will discuss how you could possibly take challah from dough which is tameh on Pesach. We'll describe what the problem is and what potential solutions are. So let's first of all reanalyze our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had discussed the dough that's stuck in the cracks of the basket. The basket is made from woven fronds together. There are gaps between the fronds. In order to fill the gaps, you fill it with cement, and that cement happens to be dough. So what do you do with it? So the Mishnah had two halves to this halacha. The first half was whether or not it's chametz. And it had said it depends on the size. If it's more than a concise, then it's chametz. Less than concise, it's not. We had a whole sugya on that, but that's what we need to know for now. The second half of the Mishnah says as follows. The same applies to tumah, says the Mishnah. The same applies to tumah, v'chein l'inyan tumah, that it depends if you're makbid on it, if it's a chatzitza. If you're makbid, meaning you don't want it to be there and you're going to remove it, then it's a chatzitza. If you do want it to be there, then it is a chatzitza. So the Gemara launches right away into the obvious kasha that what does this have to do with the first half of the Mishnah? First half of the Mishnah said the dough's status depends on its size. The second half of the Mishnah says the dough's status depends on whether or not you plan on leaving it there, whether it bothers you. So why v'chein? Why and just like? Why the same thing? It's not the same at all. So Gemara has four approaches. So Yehuda says, you're right, it's not the same. When what it means to say is that that it's not the same. You read it as einin tuma eina kain. So Abaye says it's very imprecise reading of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that it is the same. So now we're going to have three approaches which will try to fit it in. The three approaches all follow the same structure, but each one is more precise in the wording of the Mishnah than the one before. The structure of these three approaches are as follows. When we say v'chein l'inyan tumah, that's one halacha. That's v'chein l'inyan tumah. The same halacha applies to tumah. That is, on Pesach, a certain halacha related to tumah applies just like the first half of the Mishnah, that the status of the dough in the basket depends on the size of the dough. If it's more than a kazayas, then it's one halacha. If it's less than a kazayas, it's a different halacha. That's the v'chein. The v'chein is only going on the words l'inyan tumah. Then the rest of the Mishnah, which says that it depends if it's a chatzitza or not, if you're makbid on it, whether you care, you plan to remove the dough from there, that is saying that the rest of the year, where it's not Pesach, there the same halacha depends on kepeda. So again, how does the Mishnah work? The first halacha is about chametz, that says depends on size. Then we say v'chein l'inyan tumah on Pesach. A certain halacha as far as tumah on Pesach also depends on size. But the rest of the year, that halacha depends on whether you're makbid on it, whether you plan on removing it, or you're planning on leaving it there, whether it bothers you or not. So now, what are the three structures? So according to Abaye, the Mishnah is discussing combining pieces of food together to make the minimum size to be makabel tumas eichlin. Tumas eichlin is a special tumah of food. In order for it to stick, you got to have at least an egg's size worth of tumah. So you have to have a bunch of egg pieces. Says Abaye, if it is on Pesach, then we say v'chein l'inyan tumah. It goes by a kazayas. Because Pesach, chametz, is an iser, and therefore it's a very chashav. It has a very significant size. When you have a kazayas of iser, when you have a kazayas of chametz on Pesach, it has significant halachas. Therefore, it becomes important, and therefore it is mekabel tumah, and it can be mitzarif to the share of tumas eichlin. It can combine to make the minimum size of tumas eichlin of an egg, even though it's a kazayas. Now, which is less than an egg. Now, that is not true the rest of the year. Depends on whether you're makbid on it or not. If you're makbid on it, then you're planning on removing it, then it is considered to be significant. It shows that it bothers you, and therefore it is important, and therefore it is mitzvah to the share, even if it's only kazayas size or less. But if it is, if you are not makbid on it, they don't care about it, and it's not significant. Now, Rava criticizes, and he said, you're telling me that the Mishnah, when it says about Tumah, is discussing pieces of food, small pieces of food combining together to make the minimum size the shear. But that's not what the Mishnah said. The Mishnah didn't say anything about combining. The Mishnah said chatzitza. The Mishnah said if you're makbid on it, then it is a chatzitza. If you're not makbid on it, it's not a chatzitza. That means that it blocks, it interferes. So according to your interpretation, that language doesn't really make sense. So the Gemara therefore quotes Rava's approach. Rava says we're not talking about that. We're talking about putting it in the mikvah. Where it's tummy and you want to be metahiret, we want to discuss putting it in the mikvah. So the halacha is if something is significant, then it's a chatzitza. If it's not significant, then it's not. So the Mishnah therefore reads as follows. On Pesach, where a small amount of chametz is significant, even if you're not makbid on it, you don't care about it, you have to get rid of it anyway because it's chametz. So then it depends on the size. If it's a concise, you have to get rid of it, and therefore it's chatzitza. If it's not a concise, you do not have to get rid of it. Anything which you don't have to get rid of and you're leaving there is not a chatzitza. Therefore, it depends on size. However, the rest of the year, it doesn't depend on size. It depends on your intention. If you intend on leaving it there, so then it's not a problem. It's part of the basket. It's not a chatzitza. However, if you do not intend on leaving it there, you want to get rid of it, you're makbid on it, it bothers you, then it is a chatzitza, and it would not. You cannot do tefillah with the thing still in there. Says the Gemara. Rav Papa criticizes Rav, and he says your language is also imprecise. According to you, it's not about tumah. It's about tahara. It's about taking tumah off. It shouldn't say v'chein le'inyan tumah. It should say v'chein le'inyan tahara. So therefore, Rav Papa says, let's adjust this a little bit. It's chatzitza for tumah. That means if you touch something to the dough in the basket, is that matame the basket or not? Is it considered like you're touching the basket because the dough is part of the basket and you're touching the basket, or is it considered a chatzitza? Is it considered something interfering between your tumah and the basket? So that depends on whether you're planning on leaving it there, and depends on whether you care. On Pesach, where a minimum size is a kezayis, that is significant and you have to remove it. So then if you're planning on removing it, then it's a chatzitza, and then you weren't matame the basket. If however if it's less than a kezayis, you don't have to remove it. It's not matame the basket. The rest of the year, it doesn't depend on size. There's no significance to the size. It depends on whether you like it, you care, you're planning on leaving it, you're not planning on leaving it, and that's what the Mishnah means. Okay, now we get to our next Mishnah, which discusses when does a dough become chametz. So the Mishnah does not mention the standard halacha, which is that you look at the dough and you can see when it becomes chametz, which we have seen earlier, and we'll see the actual Mishnah which quotes it later, that it's a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda whether it's when the dough turns white or it begins to crack. But here the Mishnah is discussing if you have a funny kind of dough, it doesn't show any signs, so you can't tell based on simanim. So what do you do? The Mishnah calls it batek hacheresh, the deaf dough. It does not indicate whether it's becoming chametz or not. So the Mishnah says it has to go by the standard time it takes for a similar dough to become chametz. Says the Gemara, what is that standard time? The Gemara says Rabbi Yevo in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. It's as long as it takes for a person to walk from Migdal Nunya to Tveria, which is a mil, 1 mil, which is it takes about 18 minutes to walk, and that's where we get the number 18 minutes from as far as something becoming chametz. Says the Gemara, well, why don't you just say a mil? Why do you have to say as far as to walk from Migdal Nuni to Tveria? So the Gemara says, I'm trying to tell you how much a mil is. I want to define a mil for you. It's important. Halacha, we need to know. Mil comes up many places. Matter of fact, here's an example of some of those places where it comes up. Rabbi Yevo also said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, there are 4 halachas that require 4 milin. What's that? If you are traveling on the road and you want to stop, but there's a minyan ahead of you, so should you keep going in order to daven with a minyan? So if it's 4 milin ahead of you, then you have to go. If it's more than 4 mil, you don't have to continue. You could stop here. You don't have to worry about davening with a minyan. Now, if you want to wash for bread, if you want to eat bread and there's water to wash within a mil ahead of you, then you should within 4 mil ahead of you, then you should travel 4 mil. If not, you don't have to go further in order to wash your bread. You could stop and eat it here without washing. Now, the other case is that if you are working for somebody as a dough kneader, you're making bread for him, and he gave you tools, he gave you kalim to use to make the dough, but the kalim are tamei. Do you have to go to the mikveh to be metabel his kalim, to be metar them, so it shouldn't make the dough tamei? So if there's water, if there's a mikvah within 4 mil, you got to go. If there isn't, then you don't have to go further than 4 mil in order to get to a mikvah. Says the Gemara, Rav Nachman Yitzchak says that first of all, this wasn't Rabbi Avo who said it. It was a different chacham named Eivoi, and he had a 4th halacha. The 4th halacha is There are skins of certain animals that are soft, and they count as flesh. It's important halacha as far as tuma, whether something is considered flesh or it's considered to be a kli, it's hardened. So for these animals, they have soft skin, it's considered as flesh. However, if you work the skin into leather, so at a certain point, it's not considered flesh anymore. It's not considered like meat. It's considered to be an object, not food, not flesh. What is that status? So if you started working it, the amount of time that it takes to walk 4 mil, that means that you either worked it, you had it in the chemicals that harden it, or you had people stepping on it. They used to spread out skins for people to step on, and that would help work it. So if you did 4 mils worth of work, then it is no longer considered to be flesh. Okay, now the Gemara goes back to the halachos of walking for water or for a minyan. The Gemara says you only have to walk ahead of you 4 mil. If you have to go out of your way, meaning if it's behind you, you have to backtrack a mil. So then you don't have to go back even a mil. You don't even have to go 1 mil out of your way. It says the Gemara, it's only 1 mil you don't have to go, but less than a mil, you do have to go out of your way. Okay, we now move on to our next Mishnah, which discusses what happens if you have a dough which is tameh. You got to take challah from the dough. What should you do with it? We'll describe the problem. 3 opinions in the Mishnah how to resolve it. The Gemara will focus on a machlokes between 2 of them. The Gemara will try to figure out the machlokes. One of the options will be a concept called hoil. And the Gemara will get deep into the concept of hoil, where it applies, where it doesn't apply, and some hold of it, some don't hold of it, which takes us into a discussion of Hilchas Yom Tov. So first of all, the Mishnah says as follows: if you make bread, you make matzah on Pesach, you plan to bake matzah, but you made the dough, and then the dough becomes tameh. Now the problem is you got to take challah. You have to separate challah and give it to the kohen. You can't eat the dough otherwise. You can't eat the matzah. The thing is, since it's tameh, the challah you're going to separate will be tameh. Challah which is tameh is problematic. A kohen can't eat it. As a matter of fact, nobody can eat it. Since you can't eat it, you have no heter to bake it on Yom Tov. It's forbidden to bake. The only reason you're allowed to bake is because you plan on eating it. It's permitted to do the malacha of baking on Yom Tov for food purposes. But this challah can't be eaten. If it can't be eaten, then there's no heter to bake it. Now, what are you supposed to do then? Leave it? You just leave it. It'll become chametz. So the only other solution is to burn it and have it be completely destroyed like you're destroying chametz, or to feed it to your dog. But you're not allowed to do either of that. You're not allowed to burn and destroy kodesh, kachim, holy things on Yom Tov. So you're left with no options. So what are you supposed to do? You have the dough now. It's becoming chametz as we speak. You got to figure out a solution. So Rabbi Elazar says, bake it. Bake it now, even though you haven't separated challah. You can bake it, make sure that it doesn't become chametz. Then you take challah from the baked. Rabbi Elazar holds you're allowed to take challah from it after it's baked already. Now, why are you allowed to bake it? You're baking something which is asur. You're going to end up baking the challah part of it. So Rashi says either you could take off a crumb, and that crumb is insignificant, but it paters challah. Or there's a solution which he says later that you're allowed to say that, listen, I can bake each of them because maybe this one is not going to be the one that's going to be the actual challah. Each one, you can't point to it and say, this is forbidden for you to bake because you're not going to eat this. This won't be the piece, that'll be challah. Anyway, that's Rabbi Elazar's solution. Now, the Gemara says that Ben Bseira said, put it into cold water until after Yom Tov. If it's sitting in cold water, it won't become chametz. Rabbi Shua doesn't argue with that, but he does argue on Rabbi Elazar, and he says, you don't need to do any of this. He says, this will not be a problem. Let it become chametz. Not any issue. It doesn't belong to you. Who does it belong to? Nobody. You can't keep it for yourself because it's chal. It's got to go to the kohen. It doesn't belong to the kohen because you didn't give it to him yet, and you're not going to give it to him because it's tameh. So it doesn't belong to anybody, so there's no isser. Leave it, let it become chametz. It doesn't bother anybody. You don't violate by your matzeh. It's only a problem if you were to actually own it. Now the Gemara says, okay, so we have a machlokes here between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, whether or not you own challah, at least tameh challah, whether or not you own it. Does it belong to you or not? So the Gemara says, what is this machlokes based on? So the Gemara first wants to say that maybe the machlokes is based on the issue of whether you have the teivas hana that you have, is that considered to be of monetary value or not? What's teivas hana? Teivas hana is the right to choose which kohen gets the challah. We know that a Yisrael has the right to choose who he wants to give his matnas kahuna to, who he wants to give his gifts to kohanim to. So he can choose who to give the challah. As a matter of fact, somebody could pay him. Somebody could say, here, listen, here's $5. Give your challah to a specific kohen that I will designate to you. It's worth a bit of money. Now the question is, the fact that you have that right, does that mean that you own the challah? Now, you can't own something unless it has monetary value. That tiny bit of monetary value, does that mean that it belongs to you or not? So according to Rabbi Eliezer, it belongs to you, and it's a problem if it becomes chametz because that bit of value gives it value and therefore it belongs to you. According to Rabbi Shua, no, that doesn't belong to you. Says the Gemara, no, not necessarily. That is not necessarily what the machlokes is about. Really, everybody holds that that's not money. It has no value. Here we're arguing about something else. We're arguing about the following thing. Technically, you could make it un-chala. Once you separate the chala, you can undo the designation as chala. You can go to a chacham, and just like you could be matir neder, you could take off the designation of chala. What chala really is a neder. When you say hareiz v'chala, that's a neder. You're promising to give it to the kohen. You're designing it to be chala. It's kriyas shem. So you could take that off. Since I could take it off, we have a concept called hoil. Hoil says that because I have the potential to do something that gives me certain rights already now, since I could potentially take the designation of challah off the dough, therefore I have rights to it even now, mikoyach that potential that I have, and therefore it belongs to me. That's what Rabbi Eliezer holds. Rabbi Shua says, no, we do not say hoil. We do not give you any rights based on something you could potentially do. The fact that you could potentially make it yours doesn't give you any ownership to it now. Okay, now the Gemara wants to discuss this concept of hoil, that since you have potential to do something that gives you a certain amount of rights to that, or certain halachic factors based on the potential to do something, and this appears in a number of halachos and shots. So the Gemara first brings it up by concerning the halacha of baking bread on a regular Yom Tov that you plan on eating during the week. Now the halacha is you're only supposed to do malacha of baking or cooking on Yom Tov if you're planning on eating it on Yom Tov. If you plan on eating it during the week, not supposed to do that. Not supposed to bake it on Yom Tov for that. So that is potentially an isser. So the Gemara says the machlok is between of Chizda and Rabbah whether you violated an isser daraisa of baking on Yom Tov, not l'tzayrach, not for the purpose of eating on Yom Tov or not. What's that machlok is about? Again, since it is possible that guests will come and you will end up feeding this bread to them even now, you baked it for after Yom Tov. But since it's possible that it'll end up being used on Yom Tov, therefore there's potential that it'll be needed for Yom Tov. Since there is potential, that creates the rights for you to bake it even now. Rabbah says you do not do anything wrong. You don't get malchus for it. You didn't violate the Isser. We do say that there is potential. We do say hoel. And Rav Chizda says, no, we don't say hoel. Now the Gemara says, let's bring a couple of proofs in this machlokes over here. Rabbah brings a proof. He says, I'll prove to you that you do say hoel because you're allowed to cook on Shabbos. You're allowed to cook on Yom Tov. You're allowed to cook on Yom Tov, which is the day before Shabbos, in order to have food to eat on Shabbos. Now, in order to do that, you need to make an Erev Tavshilin. But why are you allowed to do that at all? It must be because we say hoel, because potentially you could end up needing it on Yom Tov. Otherwise, why would you be allowed to? Rav Chizda said, what do you mean? You do it because it's an Erev Tavshilin. Erev Tavshilin is what makes it permitted, not because of hoel. So Rabbah says Erev Tavshilin. Erev Tavshilin is a derabanan, it's a rabbinical enactment. That doesn't help for the Isser D'Oraisa of cooking on Yom Tov. How are you allowed to do that? So Gemara says, what are you talking about? Cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos is not an Isser D'Oraisa. That's one Kedusha. Yom Tov Kedusha Shabbos is no problem as far as Hilchos, as far as the D'Oraisa is concerned. D'Oraisa you're allowed to. It's only the Rabbanan who said don't cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos. That follows because if you do that, people are going to end up cooking on Yom Tov for a weekday that follows. So there was a rabbinical prohibition, so they created a heter called Erev Tavshilin. If you have to make an Erev Tavshilin, people will remember and they'll notice, oh, you're only allowed to do this because it's Shabbos coming up and not a weekday. But if it would be a weekday, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. Okay, now the Gemara has another kasha or raya on the subject. And the halach is as follows. If you have an animal that is dying and you're afraid it's going to become an avela, you would like to shecht it in order that it's killed properly so that its meat should be kosher. So you want to kill it right away. The question is, are you allowed to do that on Yom Tov? So as long as you're going to eat it, you could do it. Shechita is a malacha. You're only allowed to shecht on Yom Tov if you're going to eat it. So says the Gemara, you're allowed to as long as you have enough time to prepare at least one olive size, one kezayis of this animal's meat to eat on Yom Tov. That means you have enough time to shecht it, to get the meat out, to roast it, and then you could eat it. If you have enough time to do all that on Yom Tov, then it's okay. So Gemara says, what do you mean? This means that we're discussing where it's after the meal. You're not hungry. You have no need for it. So why should you be allowed to do that? It must be because since the concept of a hoil applies, that because you could potentially end up needing it, therefore you are allowed to shecht it. Otherwise, why should I be allowed to do it? Gemara says, Rav Chizda answered, no, this is different because you're going to lose a lot of money, we allow it. Lose a lot of money. Lose a lot of money is a reason to violate an Isser D'Oraisa of Shechita on Yom Tov. What kind of answer is that? The Gemara says yes, because he's going to lose a lot of money, therefore he actually wants to eat that concise. He's going to go and eat that concise because he wants to, not because potentially he could eat a concise, and therefore he has a reason to say, oh, well, no, he's going to actually go and eat that. And if he wants to eat that concise, he's got to shech the whole animal, and therefore he has the heter to shech the whole animal in order to save himself a loss because he intends on eating that.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.